On a cold, grey morning in October 1603, only months after the death of Queen Elizabeth I, a group of royal attendants, physicians, and embalmers stood in uneasy silence deep beneath Westminster Abbey. The flickering lanterns threw trembling shadows against the stone walls as they prepared for a task few in the kingdom knew was even happening. The Virgin Queen, glorified in paintings, feared by rivals, and immortalized through decades of powerful rule, was no longer a majestic figure seated upon her throne. She was now a body, a decaying body inside a wooden coffin that had begun to leak an unbearable stench through the vault. Strict orders had been issued from the crown. The coffin must be inspected, resealed, and prepared for a more permanent placement within the abbey. But none of the men present that day could have predicted what they were about to witness. As the nails were slowly pried open and the heavy lid lifted, the air turned thick and sour. The smell was overwhelming, so powerful that several attendants staggered back, covering their noses, their eyes tearing from the foul fumes. Before them lay what remained of a queen who had ruled England for 44 years, shaping the destiny of Europe and forging the era that would later be immortalized as the Elizabethan Age. To understand why opening her coffin became such a grim necessity, and why her corpse decayed with unusual ferocity, one must first understand the chaotic final days of her life. Queen Elizabeth I, born in 1533, had survived plots, assassinations, religious wars, and political betrayals. By the time she reached her late 60s, she had lost nearly all those closest to her. Her lifelong friend Robert Dudley, her trusted advisers, key nobles she had relied on for decades. England was at peace, but the Queen herself was fading. In March 1603, Elizabeth fell into a deep, melancholic decline. She refused to sleep in a bed, believing it would hasten her death. She stood for hours, silent and unmoving, her ladies, in waiting, watching helplessly as her strength drained away. When she finally collapsed and took to her cushions, she whispered that she saw shadows of the dead around her. Her physicians, already limited by the medical knowledge of the era, could do nothing. She died on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace. Immediately after her death, tradition demanded that her body be embalmed to slow decay until the long state funeral could take place. But Elizabeth's body resisted preservation. Multiple historical accounts suggest her internal organs had already begun to deteriorate rapidly before her death, likely because she had been sick for far longer than she admitted publicly. Some scholars believe she suffered from a form of blood poisoning or a long-term infection. Others point to heavy cosmetic use. The Queen was known to wear thick layers of white lead makeup, which could have caused internal damage after decades of use. Her embalmers struggled to mask the rapid decomposition. By the time her coffin was transported from Richmond to Whitehall, the smell was so strong that mourners reported a strange odor trailing behind the funeral cart. Still, thousands lined the streets to see her one last time, crying out as the procession passed. The Virgin Queen, the last of the Tudor monarchs, was gone. When the coffin was placed temporarily within Westminster Abbey, the Abbey staff made a disturbing discovery within weeks. The stench had returned. Despite layers of spices, herbs, linen wrappings, and resin traditional embalming materials of the era, the Queen's body was breaking down too quickly. The coffin itself had become swollen, leaking dark fluids that seeped through the wood and onto the stone floors beneath. It was an alarming sight, one that risked not only disrespecting the monarch, but also harming the sanctity of the abbey. And so, a secret order was issued to open the coffin, inspect the remains, and reseal it properly. And now, in the dimly lit chamber that October, the men responsible for the unpleasant task faced the Queen as no one had ever seen her. What they found shocked even them. Elizabeth's once striking features were nearly unrecognizable. Her famously sharp cheekbones had collapsed. Her lips had drawn tightly over her teeth, leaving her mouth slightly parted in a grim expression. The thick red wig she had worn to conceal her thinning hair had slipped, exposing patches of her scalp. Embalming materials had darkened and hardened around her body, forming a strange crust. Her royal garments, lined with silk and embroidered with gold, had fused into the decaying flesh beneath. The attendants worked quickly, using cloth soaked in wine and lavender oil to clean what they could. New layers of resin and linen were applied. Charcoal was placed around the interior to absorb moisture and odor. The coffin was reinforced with iron bands. The entire process lasted hours, the air slowly becoming breathable again as the fresh materials masked the worst of the stench. Once resealed, the Queen's coffin was prepared for its final journey into a grand tomb. But even in death, Elizabeth's story took one final twist. She would not ultimately rest alone. Her successor, King James I*, ordered that Elizabeth be buried in the same vault as her hearth. Sister, Queen Mary I*, the very woman who had imprisoned her, threatened her life, and declared her a traitor. It was a symbolic act, meant to show unity between Catholics and Protestants. Yet it also meant that Elizabeth, the Protestant icon who had reshaped a nation's identity, would lie for eternity beside the sister who tried to destroy her. The opening of Elizabeth's stinking coffin became an infamous but rarely spoken chapter of English history, buried beneath the grandeur of her reign. Yet it reveals something profound about Tudor monarchy. Even the most powerful rulers, even those who shaped an age, ultimately returned to the same mortal decay as the peasants they governed. Elizabeth, who had carefully crafted her image as an ageless, untouchable Gloriana, was no exception. Her legacy would live on in the theatres of Shakespeare, in the navy that defeated the Spanish Armada, and in the cultural explosion that defined the 16th century. But the grim reality beneath Westminster Abbey that day served as a chilling reminder that history's greatest figures are, in the end, human. When Queen Elizabeth I's coffin was secretly opened beneath the stone arches of Westminster Abbey in late 1603, the foul smell that escaped was not only the stench of death, it was the stench of a political era ending and a new age struggling to define itself. What the attendants witnessed inside that coffin was horrifying, but the story behind why Elizabeth's body decayed so violently reveals deeper truths about her life, her monarchy, and the state of England at the moment of her passing. To understand why her coffin became infamous for its unbearable odor, we must return to the final years of her reign, a period marked by anxiety, illness, political uncertainty, and the hidden pressures placed on a queen who had maintained an image of flawless power for nearly half a century. As she approached 70, Elizabeth was no longer the radiant Gloriana celebrated in portraits. She was physically weakened, emotionally isolated, and politically cornered by the very court she had mastered for decades. By the late 1590s, the Queen's health had deteriorated significantly. She suffered from chronic throat infections, swollen gums, migraines, severe joint pain, and fatigue. Her close attendants reported that she struggled to chew food and sometimes preferred liquids or soft bread. Her physicians believed she developed dropsy, a condition causing fluid buildup in the body, often linked to kidney or heart failure. In portraits from this era carefully controlled by royal officials, the Queen's face appears stiff, almost mask-like. This was intentional. Only officially approved artists were allowed to paint her, and any depiction showing signs of aging was destroyed. But even these controlled images could not fully hide the reality. The Queen's famously white complexion was not natural. For decades, she had coated her face with a mixture called Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic blend of white lead and vinegar. This makeup was fashionable among nobles, but it was also poisonous. Over time, it damaged the skin, caused hair loss, darkened the teeth, and could even seep into the bloodstream. Many modern historians believe that Elizabeth's long-term cosmetic use was slowly poisoning her from the inside. When she died in March 1603, the internal damage was far more severe than her embalmers anticipated. The lead compounds, along with possible kidney failure and infection, meant her organs were already decaying before she even drew her final breath. In such cases, embalming methods available in the early 17th century were almost useless, and Tudor embalming was far from modern science. Physicians removed the intestinal organs, washed the body in wine, coated it with aromatic herbs and spices, stuffed the abdominal cavity with sawdust or linen, then wrapped the corpse tightly in cloth before sealing it in a coffin with pitch and resin. This could delay decomposition, but only if the body was relatively stable. Elizabeth's was not. Within days, her coffin began swelling from internal gases. The wooden boards creaked. Dark fluids soaked the linen inside. By the time her body travelled in the grand funeral procession from Richmond to Whitehall, crowds reported a disturbing odour drifting from the cart. Despite the careful placement of flowers and burning incense, the stench grew stronger as warmer spring temperatures accelerated decay. But why was the coffin opened at all? Most monarchs were buried without such grisly inspections. The answer lies in the chaos that followed her death. When Elizabeth died, the Tudor dynasty ended. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, was eager to assert his authority immediately. Though he publicly honoured Elizabeth, privately he viewed her reign as an era of division and mismanagement. He wanted his rule to mark a clean break from the past. However, there was a political problem. Elizabeth's burial arrangements had been rushed. Her coffin was placed temporarily in a vault near that of her grandfather, Henry Roman VII. But the Abbey staff soon noticed the overwhelming smell coming from the Queen's coffin. Visitors complained. Priests expressed concern. The odour was so strong it reached the nave during morning prayers. If news of this spread, it would tarnish the image of England's most iconic monarch and embarrass the new king. James quietly authorized a group of trusted attendants, physicians, and embalmers to open and reseal the coffin before Elizabeth was moved to her permanent resting place. This was not a public event. It was done in secrecy, away from the court, largely at night. The men who carried out the task were sworn to silence, their names rarely recorded. The scene was horrific. When the coffin lid was removed, the Queen's remains were in a state of advanced decomposition. The resin used in embalming had failed. The gold, threaded burial gown was stained dark. The body emitted gases so strong that several attendants vomited. The Queen's once majestic red wig had slipped from her scalp, revealing thinning, discoloured hair beneath. Her skin had darkened, shrunk, and hardened in places, while other areas had liquefied. The attendants faced immense pressure. They were dishonouring no ordinary corpse. They were disturbing Gloriana, the monarch who oversaw the Spanish Armada's defeat, the expansion of England's oceans, and the cultural explosion of Shakespeare's era. Everything had to be done with dignity, even though the scene was anything but dignified. They cleaned the coffin using wine-soaked cloths. They replaced portions of the linen wrappings. They scattered charcoal around the body to absorb moisture. They carefully applied fresh resin and herbs to mask the odour. Then they reinforced the coffin with iron bands and sealed it shut again. This time, no air could escape. After the coffin was resealed, Elizabeth's remains were placed in a grand tomb near the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. But James also made a symbolic decision that surprised many. Instead of giving Elizabeth her own separate tomb, he ordered that she be buried in the same vault as her half, Sister Mary I. The two sisters, one Catholic, one Protestant, had lived much of their lives as rivals. Mary had imprisoned Elizabeth, interrogated her, and nearly executed her. Yet in death they would lie together. The inscription on their tomb reads, "Queen Elizabeth lies here, buried with her sister, Queen Mary." Two sisters in one tomb. James intended this as a gesture of unity, a signal that the religious civil war dividing England for decades had, at least symbolically, ended. Yet, ironically, the Queen who had shaped an age, preserved her throne against countless threats, and commanded loyalty from millions could not escape the one truth that her portraits, her speeches, and her carefully curated image had hidden for decades. Her humanity, her mortality, her decay, the stinking coffin beneath Westminster Abbey was the final reminder that even the greatest monarchs end as all humans do. But Elizabeth's legacy did not rot with her body. Her reign left behind a transformed England, stronger, more unified, and on the path toward becoming a global power. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. Her life marked the birth of an empire. The opening of Queen Elizabeth's stinking coffin in late 1603 was not just a physical act. It became a turning point in whispered rumors, political maneuvering, and the secret anxieties that haunted the courts of both the Tudors and the new Stuart monarchy. What seemed like an isolated moment of decay inside Westminster Abbey was actually the result of decades of hidden tension, mismanagement, and the symbolic collapse of a political world built entirely around the charisma and survival of one woman. To understand why the coffin became such a matter of concern, we must dive deeper into the quiet fears that surrounded Elizabeth in her final years and the immediate political landscape following her death. Throughout Elizabeth's reign, her image had been her greatest weapon. She had used it to manipulate foreign powers, win public devotion, and maintain control over a male, dominated political structure that had never accepted the idea of a ruling woman. Elizabeth survived by transforming herself into a myth. She became Gloriana, the fairy queen, the virgin mother of her people. Her face was painted white and flawless, every portrait carefully controlled to present her as eternally youthful and untouched by time. She knew the power of appearances in a world where kings ruled by divine right. Yet behind this imagery lay uncertainty. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir had terrified her council for decades. Many believed that announcing a successor too early would weaken her rule, encourage plots, or spark civil war. Others accused her of indecision, but Elizabeth's deeper reason was psychological. She feared becoming irrelevant. The moment she named a successor, she believed her own life would be in danger, just as it had been during Mary I's reign. The result of this secrecy was that when Elizabeth died, England had no official transition plan. This vacuum produced a whirlwind of anxiety, even among her closest counselors. Courtiers scrambled to align themselves with the rising Stuart dynasty. Nobles panicked about their estates. Bishops wondered if the new king would undo the Protestant reforms Elizabeth had fiercely defended. The stench from her coffin became a dark metaphor for the decaying Tudor system. This political uncertainty extended into the realm of rumor. In the weeks following Elizabeth's death, whispers spread across London. Some questioned whether she had died peacefully, or whether her decline had been far more violent than reported. Others claimed she suffered from a hidden illness. There were even rumors that she refused to let her ladies remove her rings or change her clothing because she feared they would see her body wasting away. Londoners, influenced by superstition, believed the stinking coffin was a sign of divine judgment. They said no pure queen would rot so quickly. These whispers were dangerous. In an age when monarchs ruled by the will of God, a rapidly decaying corpse could be interpreted as a spiritual warning. Church officials feared these rumors. Priests worried that Catholics might use the event as propaganda, claiming that Elizabeth's Protestant faith had been rejected by heaven. At the same time, Protestants feared their enemies would use the coffin to undermine the cult of Gloriana that had been built around her. This was why the opening of the coffin had to remain a secret, to preserve both the dignity of the dead queen and the stability of the living kingdom. The new king, James I, recognized the threat immediately. His position was unstable during his first months in England. Although Elizabeth had ruled with iron charisma, James lacked her presence. The English viewed him with suspicion, seeing him as a foreigner from Scotland. He knew he could not afford any scandal. The last thing he needed was a story spreading that the great Elizabeth Tudor had been reduced to a grotesque sight inside a leaking coffin. This is why James acted quickly. Reports from the abbey described how the odor was seeping into nearby chapels, disturbing services and alarming staff. The king summoned his advisers and discussed whether to relocate her body, re-embalm it, or quietly reinforce the coffin. Dignity demanded secrecy. Politics demanded speed. This also explains why very few written records exist of the coffin opening. Nearly all surviving reports come from later accounts, private memoirs, monastic notes, and second-hand descriptions. The Stuart government did not want any official record connecting the monarchy to the shocking condition of Elizabeth's remains. But the odor was only one concern. There was also fear of disease. People in the 17th century believed that foul smells could spread sickness. A leaking coffin inside Westminster Abbey, one of the most important religious sites in the kingdom, was seen as both a physical and spiritual threat. The attendants sent to inspect it were chosen for their loyalty, not their expertise. They worked in silence, using wine, herbs, tar, and resin in an attempt to halt the decay. One detail that rarely appears in popular history is that Elizabeth's coffin was not the only royal coffin with this problem. Tudor burials were notorious for decay, especially when embalming was rushed, or when bodies had internal conditions that accelerated decomposition. Henry Roman VIII's coffin leaked fluids during his funeral procession, causing shock among onlookers. The Archbishop of Canterbury once remarked that the Tudors rot swiftly, as though the devil himself takes claim. The idea that Elizabeth, the last Tudor, suffered the same fate added a symbolic weight to the whispers spreading across England. Another layer of fear came from the political symbolism of Elizabeth's body. People of that era believed that monarchs carried divine favor in their physical form. A rotting body could be interpreted as the weakening of that divine protection. Since Elizabeth had ruled during times of both triumph and crisis, her followers were terrified that the smell from her coffin was a sign that God had withdrawn his blessing from England. James I worked hard to counter this narrative. He organized a grand reburial, ensuring that Elizabeth's final resting place would be dignified and magnificent. But his decision to bury her with Mary, I raised eyebrows. Why unite two sisters who had been ideological enemies? Scholars believe James used their burial to communicate a message. His monarchy would bring unity where the Tudors brought division. Catholics and Protestants would now lie together in one realm, symbolized by two sisters in one tomb. Still, even this symbolic gesture carried its own tension. Many Protestants felt betrayed. They believed Elizabeth deserved a separate resting place, one that honored her unique position as the savior of Protestant England. But the authorities silenced these voices, arguing that unity was more important than personal loyalty. In the end, Elizabeth was placed beneath a grand marble effigy, created years later, showing her lying peacefully with her hands clasped in prayer, her decaying body hidden forever beneath layers of stone. Even centuries later, when the tomb was briefly opened in the 18th century during restoration work, observers noted the lingering smell inside the vault. Time had sealed the Queen into history, but history had not entirely sealed the Queen. The story of Elizabeth's stinking coffin is more than a morbid curiosity. It is a window into the fears that shaped early modern England, fears of death, disease, succession, religion, and political identity. It reminds us that even the most powerful rulers are vulnerable. Elizabeth ruled with unmatched brilliance, but she could not escape the one truth that has humbled all monarchs in history. She was mortal. Her legacy outlived her decaying body, but those who opened her coffin witnessed a truth that the portraits and ceremonies had concealed for decades. Behind the myth of Gloriana stood a woman who aged, who suffered, and who died as all humans do. And in the dim chambers of Westminster Abbey, the Tudor dynasty's final secret leaked into the air, carrying with it the scent of an age ending. When Queen Elizabeth's stinking coffin was opened beneath the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey in late 1603, no one present realized that they were witnessing more than the decay of a monarch. They were witnessing the decay of an era, a political identity, a mythology carefully crafted across 44 years. That coffin, filled with fumes and fluids and the unmistakable reminder of human frailty, marked the true and final end of the Tudor world. But it also planted the seeds of Elizabeth's legend, shaping how future generations would remember the Queen who once commanded Europe's fear and admiration. For the men who witnessed the coffin's condition, the memory lingered long after they resealed it. Silent and shaken, they carried with them the final truth about a queen whose life had been cloaked in performance and symbolism. Elizabeth had spent her entire reign hiding her weaknesses, refusing to show age, refusing to reveal illness, refusing even to speak of death. She believed that the moment she appeared vulnerable, she would lose control of her kingdom. Her portraits were softened and idealized. Her speeches were dramatic and commanding. Her image was the armor that protected England. Yet inside that coffin, beneath the resin, silk, and gold embroidery, her body had transformed into a stark reminder that death strips all illusions away. Ironically, the same decay that Elizabeth feared would destroy her image ultimately helped make her immortal in history. After her burial, the stench faded. The coffin was sealed and secured. But the rumors surrounding it, whispers about the Queen's rapid decomposition, the coffin leaking in the Abbey, and the secret midnight inspection, began to circulate quietly among the court, the clergy, and eventually the scholars who preserved these accounts. These stories frightened some, fascinated others, and ultimately added to the mystery of a queen whose life had already taken on a near-mythic dimension. Historians later traced how these whispers transformed into narratives. Elizabeth became not just a ruler but a symbol, a woman who stood against patriarchal opposition, foreign invasion, religious war, and internal plots. Her human weaknesses, once hidden, became part of what made her story compelling. People understood that she was not an untouchable goddess. She was a woman who carried the weight of an empire on her shoulders, who endured loneliness, heartbreak, betrayal, illness, and fear. The truth behind the coffin brought her closer to humanity, even as it lifted her further into legend. More than anything, the state of her corpse showed how she had sacrificed her life, quite literally piece by piece, for her role as monarch. Years of stress had worn her body down. The poisonous cosmetics that preserved her public image likely poisoned her health. The emotional burdens she carried, always concealed behind strong speeches, had quietly eroded her. By the time she died, she was no longer the charismatic queen one sees in the Armada portraits. She was tired, frail, and spiritually worn. In many ways, the stinking coffin symbolized the hidden truth Tudor England had been trying to conceal. Just as Elizabeth's body could not withstand the pressure of time, the Tudor dynasty could not withstand the pressure of succession. When she died without an heir, the dynasty collapsed. The coffin's odor, so powerful it shocked the Abbey staff, captured the sense of a historic era rotting from within. But this was not how Elizabeth would be remembered. Within a generation, the grim details of her burial faded behind the brilliance of her accomplishments. Her reign became known as the Golden Age of England. Shakespeare thrived under her rule. The English navy defeated the Spanish Armada. Trade expanded, exploration grew, Protestant identity solidified. But perhaps the greatest reason her legend endured was because Elizabeth represented stability in a time when Europe was drowning in religious warfare and political upheaval. James I, aware of her symbolic power, eventually embraced her legacy. Though he initially wanted to distance himself from the Tudors, he realized Elizabeth remained beloved among the people. He allowed her story to flourish, even as he tried to strengthen his own authority. But the tension between their legacies remained. Elizabeth had ruled with charisma. James ruled with theory. She ruled through loyalty. He ruled through paperwork. She appealed to emotion. He appealed to logic. The difference made her seem even more extraordinary. The Abbey tomb that houses Elizabeth I today is grand, serene, and dignified. Her marble effigy depicts her as graceful and composed, her hands folded in eternal prayer, her expression calm. Nothing betrays the truth of what her attendants witnessed when they opened that coffin. The effigy lies above a long inscription praising her virtues and achievements, though the most striking part of her tomb is not the carved stone nor the golden lettering. It is who lies beside her, Mary I. The two sisters, once divided by religious turmoil, now share the same vault. Their bones rest only inches apart. One restored Catholic rule, the other secured Protestant England. One burned Protestants as heretics, the other executed Catholic conspirators. They had been rivals in life, but through James's arrangement they became symbols of unity in death. Their tomb became a message carved in stone. England's future required peace, not division. But for many, Elizabeth's presence alongside Mary only strengthened her myth. Visitors over the centuries have reported that Elizabeth's tomb, though shared, feels undeniably hers. Her effigy rests above. Her inscriptions dominate the chamber. Her story overshadows Mary's. Even in death, she holds the central role. Yet, the story of the coffin resurfaced every time the tomb was opened for repairs or inspections. In the 18th century, when the vault was examined, workers noted a lingering, sour scent, even after almost 2 centuries. It was faint, but present, a haunting echo of that infamous stench from 1603. This unusual detail kept alive the idea that Elizabeth's death held mysteries yet untold. But the most important consequence of the stinking coffin was the role it played in lifting Elizabeth from mere monarch to cultural icon. Artists, playwrights, historians, and political thinkers used her story to shape narratives of female leadership, national identity, religious tolerance, and political strategy. Her humanity, exposed in death, made her greatness stand out even more in life. She became an example of the fragile balance between image and reality, showing that power often depends as much on symbolism as on action. Even today, people visit her tomb not simply because she was a queen, but because she represents an age. She represents English identity. She represents resilience. Her story has survived wars, revolutions, dynastic changes, and political transformations. And strangely enough, the decay of her body helped people accept that she was real, not a mythical goddess, but a woman who bore the weight of history. The opening of her coffin, disturbing as it was, served as the final chapter of her story. It revealed that the queen who conquered fear for 44 years could not escape death. It showed that the monarchy she upheld so fiercely had weaknesses just like she did. But it also ensured that Elizabeth's legend would rise above her mortality, preserved by historians and storytellers long after her body turned to dust. Her dynasty ended with her death, but her nation rose because of her life.